Taking objectives is one thing, but are you putting enough thought into holding them? Hello and welcome to Incursion Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about objectives, and more specifically, holding objectives, where things change with the ebb and flow of battle. If you find that you're taking ground in games but not able to hold on to objectives, I'm going to go through my top 5 tips for taking objectives and holding them. These are things I've seen through the various events that I run and things that I've implemented myself in my own games that have made an immediate difference to how well I'm able to hold objectives. By the end of this video, you'll have some great tactics that you can start to apply in your own games. Let's get started. This first tip is rooted in the fact that we want to be controlling the terms of engagement. We want to be getting the most out of our unit, making the right trades, scoring points, denying our opponent ground, denying our opponent points, all of that stuff. One of the primary ways which we can do that is by utilizing terrain. The objectives where we can hide stuff out of sight while still holding them are going to be prime targets for us because we can hold on to those objectives far more easily than we can hold on to ones with no protection. The ones where if we stand on them, we're just going to get shot. It's also difficult for the opponent to deep strike something near it or to run a combat unit up and take it from you that way. We're doing more than just identifying that we've got a nice objective behind a ruin that we can sit on. It's about how we can make it as difficult as possible for the opponent to get to that point. How can I use the terrain to control how units can move around? So vehicles and monsters, for example, can't go through ruin walls. And so positioning our units away from walls so we're not getting engaged in combat through the wall by placing units in such a way that your opponent has to go around the ruin walls or extending their charge rolls, we can force them into awkward positions. And if we don't have the luxury of terrain to hide behind, but we're facing into an army with lots of guns, then tip number 2 is really predominant against shooting armies in particular, and that is the element of pressure. If we are facing into a shooting army and we don't apply pressure, they dictate the terms of engagement. So when we're fighting into shooting opponents, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. If we're pushing forward and threatening our opponent's objectives, then that is going to divert attention away from the objectives we have in other parts of the board, as our opponent then has to deal with the units that are running at them. And so it's not immediately obvious, but it can be a very important way to keep your units alive at the back of the board by sending some stuff up and letting your opponent try and figure out dealing with them. And if you're trying to pressure combat units, I've done some videos that go into a bit more depth about this, but one thing we can do when we're trying to apply pressure is make full use of our piling and consolidates, provided we're meeting all the requirements we have to when we're piling in and consolidating. If we can use those moves to get into combat with as many shooting elements as possible with our combat armies, then we want to be doing that, and that's going to mean that we're tying up more than just one unit at a time. Making use of that extra movement and being able to tie up an additional unit in the shooting phase could be really pivotal in keeping your units on objectives elsewhere alive for even longer. We can project pressure in different ways and in different parts of the board. It's not always the I'm going to run at you and get into combat. For example, if we have units with sticky objectives, these can be really difficult for sticky an objective in the middle of the table and then that unit gets shot. You've still got that objective. A static gun line doesn't always want to be wandering out and having to push to get those objectives. And if you aren't familiar with sticky objectives, then it's simply a unit with the ability that you will control an objective that is controlled by that unit, even if they then move away from that objective. So if you have a unit with that ability, it's well worth including them because they can apply an annoying amount of pressure with very little effort. To this end, the simple fact of spreading out into different parts of the board makes it more difficult for a shooting army to get angles against you. Bunched into one part of the board, you're going all in on one or two objectives. It could be a lot easier for your opponent to just occupy one or two spaces in their deployment zone to see your entire army. Whereas if you're spreading out, not clustering, it could well mean our opponent has to split their army up, potentially reducing their efficiency or drawing them out of position. So even if you're not charging directly at your opponent, just the simple act of spreading out and trying to be in lots of different places at once is again another form of applying pressure. And last but by certainly no means least is lone operatives. These are the bane of any shooting army. If you have a lone operative placed on an objective in no man's land far enough back, that is a nightmare for many gun lines to have to deal with and can often be a very low points cost investment. Hold an objective comfortably and keep holding it. Before I get on to tip number 3, if you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then join the Incursion. For $2.99 a month, I do an extra video on top of the normal weekly content that I put out. Paul from Flail and I have decided to team up to make a fantastic Discord community, and it's growing by the day. We talk 40k, rules, tactics, lists. We even have a hobby section, all sorts. Don't delay, join the Incursion today. A massive thank you to the members. I'm humbled by the appreciation for the videos. And don't forget to check out the video description for affiliate links. If you're going to be buying some models, then doing so through the affiliate links is a fantastic way to support the channel. And thank you to those of you that have done so already. I've been really blown away by the support, so thank you. Tip number 3 is all about screening and deep strike denial. There are plenty of units in the game that deny deep strike within 12 inches. These units placed strategically around objectives can create a massive deep strike denial zone. Couple that with just some basic screening really helps to create a layered defense, which is something I've talked about in previous videos, again, where we have layers of units. And if you're playing against a unit that has got 3-inch deep strikes, we want to focus on making sure that a unit can't deep strike onto an objective at all. Normally they wouldn't be able to with a 9-inch deep strike. If you're on an objective, there's no point on the objective wherever you would stand and they'll be able to land on. But the 3-inch deep strike, I see this often, where if they're over on one side of an objective, then that can mean that they leave a gap the other side, just about big enough for a 3-inch deep strike to come down and land on an objective and ruin your day. So units in little circles or triangles around objectives to deny that 3-inch zone is really important. Then you've got units a bit further away, a bit further forward, that the next layer of screen, and then ahead of those you've got another layer of screen. Putting units 6 inches apart in screens, in lines around, then you've got this layer stretching out, almost imagining like ripples forming out from that objective, meaning you've got full control and full denial over your opponent's ability to deep strike anywhere near that objective. I talked about shooting armies, but what about if we're facing a more combat focused army? Again, the distance and positioning makes a huge difference as to our ability to hold objectives. If we've got models that are on an objective, placing our units as far back on the objective as possible forces longer charges and increases the likelihood that we'll be able to hold on to those objectives for longer. We can also use heroic interventions. If we've got a unit nearby with a heroic intervention ability, we can then use a heroic intervention to intercept before they pile in. So if they've charged in and not got as many models onto an objective, we can heroic intervention with our other unit and tag models in that unit to prevent them moving any further forward. That might limit the amount of OC on an objective. And I go into more detail about that here. Anything with fights first is also a real pain to have to deal with, particularly for other melee armies. If you've got a unit with fights first on an objective, at the very least it makes it more difficult for an opponent just to walk up, charge and remove units that you've got on an objective. So anything like that, if you're trying to get in the thick of it, are able to hide on objectives and not be worrying about being shot at, but you want to make that objective as defensible as possible, fights first is a great way to hold on to things. And then the good old-fashioned countercharge. If you've put something that's relatively flimsy, knowing that you might not hold it for the next turn, but it draws out an opponent, then you can countercharge with something else. Whilst you might not be holding it for very long in the first instance, thinking about how you can ultimately come out on top of any sort of exchange, any kind of trade like that is important. And then it becomes acceptable to lose an objective for a turn if we can ultimately end up holding on to it in the end. And at the very least, if our opponent doesn't take the bait, they see the danger, that might prevent them from running up and taking that objective, in which case the small fragile unit that we put there in the first instance is just going to continue to hold it, and that's great. And last but by no means least, in fact is the most important one of all, is count the OC. Count the objective control number, not just of what you've got and what your opponent's got, but think about what's going to unfold. For example, say you've got a unit of orc knobs that they run up and they charge into a transport, they kill the transport, but then out of the wreckage comes out a battle line unit with high OC, and now you're not controlling that objective anymore. Whereas if you hadn't destroyed the transport, the knobs had just sat there on the objective, you would have had that objective. It's really important to think about not just how many OC we have at any given time, but what OC is going to be on that objective once all the phases have played out. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've caught people out with Astra Militarum orders in my opponent's phase when you use duty and honor to increase your OC, or watching armies where they have the ability to bring models back. You can see the light leave people's eyes when they think they have an objective and then something gets resurrected and then all of a sudden they don't have that objective anymore. It results in a big point swing on primary. It's super frustrating, and so having a full understanding of those things is really important. The last thing we want to do is give away an objective that we thought we were comfortably holding on to because we hadn't accounted for a difference in OC that wasn't immediately visible. If that means checking rules with our opponent, asking questions to get a full understanding of how OC can switch with abilities that you're not familiar with, then ask away. It's always better to be asking a question rather than being in a position where you've now lost something and it's way past the point where you can do anything about it. So I found these tips have really helped to hold objectives, not just to take objectives, but to take them and keep them, ultimately making it difficult for my opponent just to rock up and take objectives off me. And the thing that can help take this to the next level is understanding how we can deploy to set up these kind of things in the first place. And I made a video about advanced deployment tactics, which you can check out here. In the meantime, that's all from me for now. Thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.